Hi guys, so this idea of this little video is just to talk you through the basics of the coursework and the rules and regulations and requirements really. Um, it's basically talking through the webpage called Coursework FAQ for Mike students, which is on Moodle. So you ought to read that, but this might just help to clarify things maybe. But I'll just take you through it and see if there's anything else that comes up that seems worth expanding on, etc. Okay, so you're doing 2 coursework essays in total over the course. First one is end of this year, and then beginning in next year, the first thing you do in the second year is a second coursework essay, which will probably be on Carol Ann Duffy, but we don't need to worry about that. So we're forgetting that for now. We are doing Room, okay? Other classes are doing other books. Don't worry about that, okay? Different teachers choose different books. I've chosen Room as our lockdown text because I think you can see there are some thematic relevances to our current state, and I think it's a nice accessible book to do for remote learning, so that's why we're doing it. It's going to be worth 25 marks, and this coursework essay that you do will be worth 10% of your final A-level grade. Okay, so together with your second coursework essay, it's 20% in total. Most of your marks are for exams, is 80%, but it's not insignificant. The way I look at it is this: if you're on the borderline of a grade, your coursework could make the difference quite easily. So if you were a high B, it could nudge you into an A if you had a good coursework folder. If you were a low C, it could pull you down into a D if you had a poor coursework folder. So coursework is marks in the bag, okay? You get support from me to create assessed official work which contributes to your final assessment. So as far as I'm concerned, if there's one place where you should be applying 100% effort on the course, it is coursework. It's in your own interests. The other thing I think is that it gives us time to develop real skills of reading and particularly writing, because we're working on a draft that you do in a lot of detail, and I find that you develop a lot as a writer in that process because there's time to think about your craft as a writer more. The drafting process is quite in depth and intensive, so I think it's really educational. Okay, what makes our exam board's coursework a little bit more complicated than some others is that you have to do an area of literary theory, okay? And there is a critical anthology which is released by the board, and there are copies of this locked up in college on the shelf, which neither I nor you have access to, but there is an online copy of that on Moodle, and you have to use this in the coursework. We are using section 1, which is called Ideas About Narrative. Don't know if that's going to come out right way for you, but it's opposite way around for me. But it is section 1, Ideas About Narrative. Okay, it's basically narrative theory. There's different theories in this booklet. There's narrative, Marxism, feminism. They're the kinds of ideas, I think, that really come up if you do English at university. So if you go on to study at higher education, this stuff will be a big deal. So it's a kind of a little taste of doing English at a higher level, basically. And I think narrative theory fits Room extremely well. And for my money, it's one of the more straightforward theories to do in the booklet. So again, in terms of remote learning, that's why I've chosen that direction. Okay. So you have to do Room. There's no choice of book. You have to use a narrative theory. You get a choice of 4 titles, which we're going to look at later. So yeah, a little bit of choice, but not too much. Okay, drafting. You get to do 1 first draft. You're going to submit that on Moodle, and I'll give you some pretty detailed feedback on that. Okay, I'll basically pull that apart and try and indicate as many different ways as that can be improved to get your grade as good as possible. However, I can only do so much on comments on that draft, okay? So in my experience, I would be aiming to move, well, I think what's typical is that a grade between the first draft and final draft, it might go up a grade, 2 if you're lucky, okay? So basically, the better you get the first draft, the better your final draft's going to be. It seems obvious, but what you can't be thinking is, oh, we'll fix it in the mix. We'll just sort it out in the final draft. You basically be needing to aim to make your first draft perfect. Complete word count, polished, no gaps, as flawless as you can. And then I try and move you up a level. So that's how that process works. Deadlines are Friday 12th of June is first draft. You're going to submit that on Moodle. And then Friday 10th of July is final draft. Hopefully we'll be back in college by then and you'll be submitting that on paper, but we'll see. First draft will be coming in on Moodle on 12th of June regardless. And all classes have those same deadlines. And those deadlines are quite strict and quite important. So say if you miss your final draft deadline, it's kind of like missing an exam. You can't do it. It has to be there. Okay. So I get to mark one draft. You get one draft marked. I'm not allowed to mark more than one draft, but we can work on bits and pieces along the way. You know, I'm allowed to sort of discuss, look. You can type in me bits and pieces. We can work on in forums and all sorts of bits and pieces. But in terms of a full mark of a draft, I am only allowed to do that once. I only will do that once. So that first draft is quite a big deal. So apart from critical theory, the other thing that's I think is new for the coursework and is interesting is your research and your bibliography. Now, if you're doing history or other subjects like that, you'll be familiar with bibliographies, I hope, or you will be at some point. Bibliography is a very simple thing, really. It's a list of everything that you've read that's contributed to your essay, okay? At university, everything you write that you hand in for marking has a bibliography with it. It's a very big deal at uni and later because it's a record of the research that you've done. And the coursework for English is the only time you do bibliography work. Now, I'm going to throw quite a few sources at you in terms of critics and context, things like book reviews, okay? That's going to happen in first week. It's going to be up to you to pick and choose which of those is going to be useful for your essay, for your title. And I'm also going to require every single person to do some of their own research. So you go out, you look on the internet. Normally I'd say go to a library, but under lockdown you can't do that. But you know, plenty of stuff online. And you have to use at least one source that you've researched yourself in your bibliography, preferably more than one independent source. The better the student, the more independent research they do, basically. The exam boards doesn't really make rules about bibliography, so there isn't like so many marks for it or a minimum number of entries for the bibliography. But as far as I'm concerned, if you have less than 6 items in your bibliography, it's not long enough. You've got 2 for free because you've got to put Room, the book, in your bibliography. You've also got to put the critical anthology, so that's 2 out of the 6 straight away. So that only leaves you with another 4 minimum, but you ought to be aiming to go beyond that. I find that A-star essays typically have something like 20 items in their bibliography. Sounds a lot, but that is going to include things that you haven't directly quoted. Okay, so it can be things that have helped you think about the book, helped you form your ideas and your understanding, even if you're not quoting it in the final essay. So it should be fairly easy to get above 12 items, I would have thought, but we'll see when we get into that. Now, while we're on the topic of quotation, I should mention something about plagiarism. If you haven't heard the word plagiarism before, you need to understand it properly and why it's a very bad thing. And it can happen accidentally sometimes. Plagiarism is nicking somebody else's ideas and putting them into your essay. Okay. Now, a lot of times, I don't think schools and stuff train students very well on this. That you're not trained to quote and credit other writers in your writing, but this is where we do it on the A-level literature. So the bottom line is, if there's a sentence or half a sentence in your essay and you're using the exact words that somebody else has used on the internet, etc., okay, it has to be in quote marks, and you have to make a specific reference of where that came from: title, author, web address, so that somebody else can then go and look at it. It's a very basic rule of how academics work. Okay, you've got to give your credit, your props to other people. If you don't do that, it's regarded as pulling a fast one, basically cheating. Posh word for it is plagiarism. Even if you didn't mean to do it, even if you thought it was okay, it's no dice. You have to do this mental check. If I've used somebody else's words, I have to put it in quote marks. I have to then put that in the bibliography. And if you've paraphrased something, you put something into your own words, you should also credit that and say who said it. So, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing. You know, it's not like basically the longer your bibliography is, the better. So you should be wanting to do that. So I'll want to see how you've done reading and then how you've stitched those sources together. We'll probably talk more about using of sources and things, but I will just mention at the moment, when you're quoting critics and you're referring to things, you do need to try and do something interesting with it, rather than just saying, and I agree with this. So you need to try and combine a quote with something from the book, or put two quotes together, or disagree with something. Do you see what? Just to try and do something with the quote, try and build on it really. But we'll come back to more of that later. For now, basic idea is don't plagiarise by accident, and but I will give you more guidance on how to write bibliography. Word counts are strict. You've got to write a minimum of 1250 words, 1250 words for your first essay, and a maximum of 1500. Can't be less than 1250, and it cannot be more than 1500. And the exam board are pretty strict on that. So you'd be required to edit down on the final day if you haven't got there. So that's something to bear in mind for later. Now that word count, slightly odd this, but it's a rule for our exam board. That word count does not include quotations. Okay, so anything is in quote marks, you basically take it out of your word count. Okay, so that makes counting up your words for final draft a little bit messy and tricksy and a pain, but that's the way it works. Okay, so you hand in a number for your final word count with your final draft, and it's got to be between 1250 and 1500. Okay, final thing to talk about is the 4 essay titles. We will come back to these in more detail as we get into the essay, but basically you've got 4 options. Setting option. What significance do the settings in room have? Okay, I think that's a fairly straightforward one. We might regard that as the basic option. Okay, it might be difficult to do something very sophisticated with it. It might be a little bit hard to be dazzling with it. But again, I think it would be quite hard to mess it up, because room is such a strong setting. It's kind of a safe option. Okay, so it might suit students who weren't too confident, I think. Second option is about voices. In room, you've got the voice of a 5-year-old narrating the novel. So you talk about that voice of the narrator, and you'd look about the other voices and discourses in the book. We'll talk more about what a discourse is later, but you've got you've got Ma's voice, you've got the voice of doctors, you've got the voice of the media in part 2. I'm going to look at how those different voices work. You'll need to be able to describe and analyse what is the characteristics of these voices, like what is the grammar of a 5-year-old, what's the vocabulary of a 5-year-old, that sort of stuff, and then think about its literary effect. Okay. Inadequate narration, quite similar really. It's going to overlap a lot in terms of the content with the voices one, because again, but it's more focused because it's looking at Jack. And it's not just about his language, it's also about his viewpoint, this one. We're going to look at the idea of what an unreliable narrator is, what an inadequate narrator is, and we're going to think in detail about why is this interesting and effective in literature and in this piece of literature. So we've got some nice reading on that, and it's quite a nice topic, because basically it's kind of weird to have a book told by a 5-year-old. There's a lot that Jack doesn't understand. He's describing it, but he doesn't understand what he's describing. So that's kind of a weird setup. So that's about taking apart that not understanding, basically. Okay, and then finally, I don't know if the final one's hard or easy, really. I think we'll find out as we work on it. The title sounds a bit intimidating. It's about intertextuality. So we'll need to talk more about that later. Intertextuality is where you include one text in another text. Sounds odd, but it's actually quite straightforward with a book like Room. In Room, there's a lot of other books. Jack loves books. There's some books that come up repeatedly. There's TV shows. But a book like Alice in Wonderland becomes quite significant in Room. So you'd be looking at how Emma Donoghue is incorporating those other books into her into the text. And to give you a little bit of elbow room, something else to talk about, we're going to include the idea of discourses in there as well. And basically I think that's going to be medical discourse and media discourse. So the language of the media and the language of medical professionals. So we're going to stretch the idea of intertextuality a little bit, but the core of that will be we'll be looking at what Jack's reading, what Ma's reading, and what other works of literature get referred to in the text. So there's things like classical references and pop culture references and all sorts. And so those are the 4 options. You don't need to choose immediately, but after a couple of weeks you'll start to have your preferences for where you want to focus your attention on this. But basically we'll all learn the same stuff together for preparing for first draft, because there's a lot of overlap. After first draft we'll start to specialise more into giving you sort of individual support. So we'll do like individual Zoom meetings on individual titles and things like that. And that's basically it. I hope that's of some use to you. All of this should be summarised on Moodle in the coursework FAQ. Good luck with your coursework. I hope it's going to be fun. Bye for now.